Jews are the moral alibi for imperialism in the Middle East. Bear in mind, the first Zionists were not Jewish, they were Christian. Lord Palmerston, Napoleon, Lord Shaftesbury, and so on, and Islah Haran. They all wanted a Jewish state long before the Jews did. And in 1840, Palmerston approached the Board of Deputies of British Jews to get them to support the idea of a Jewish return. And they really weren't interested. In 1842, they passed a declaration saying that it was no part of their business to encourage Jews to return or to go to Palestine. It was the anti-Semites who wanted Jews to return. It wasn't the Jews. The Board of Deputies and what was a bourgeois Jewish community were interested in emancipation, having full equal rights in this country, not being seen to be aliens. And in fact, the main Christian evangelical supporter of Zionism, Lord Shaftesbury or Earl Shaftesbury, he opposed emancipation in this country, but of course he wanted to see the Jews go to Palestine. So, I mean, that's always been the history, and the actions of the German police today are no different from the actions of the Gestapo in the 30s. Under Heydrich in 1935, the Gestapo published a proclamation saying that the non-Zionists were to be treated differently from the Zionists. And in fact, non and anti-Zionist organizations were banned from 1936, whereas the Zionist organizations were legal until 1939. So they're following in the footsteps of their Nazi predecessors, even though they proclaim that, of course, this all stems from the Holocaust. In reality, it's a continuation of the same policy.
Yeah, I mean, among the most disgusting things that were done in terms of performative hasbara, because of course the most disgusting things that have been done have been the things done in Gaza, but watching the Israeli ambassador to the UN come in with a Star of David on his lapel was absolutely horrifying.
Yeah, I mean, in Israel, I mean, there is a certain cognitive dissonance. On one hand, they openly proclaim the need to wipe out and exterminate the Palestinians, and don't see how that might just bear some similarity to what the Nazis did with the Jews. But if I go back to 1935, on the 28th of January, Heydrich, who was the deputy head of or chief of the SS, and Gerard Rettlinger, in his book The Final Solution, calls him the real engineer of the final solution, issued a directive stating that the activity of the Zionist-oriented youth organizations that were engaged in the occupational restructuring of the Jews lies in the interest of the National Socialist State's leadership. These organizations are not to be treated with that strictness that is necessary to apply to the members of the so-called German Jewish organizations, brackets, assimilationists. And in May of the same year, the paper of the SS, Schwarzkopf, wrote that the Zionists adhere to a strict racial position, and by emigrating to Palestine, they are helping to build their own Jewish state. The assimilation-minded Jews deny their race and insist on their loyalty to Germany, or claim to be Christians because they have been baptized in order to subvert National Socialist principles. So, I mean, they were very clear on making that distinction. And of course, that distinction is made today. So it is a continuation of the policy that the Nazis themselves formulated.
And can you explain what assimilation is for people who may not know? Because that has I think, like a particular connotation, almost of like selling out, but it actually is a particular historical phenomenon.
Well, assimilation means, I suppose, that Jews assimilate to the majority but it doesn't necessarily mean getting rid of your Jewish identity. What it means is you become part of the society in which you are living. And that's cast as assimilation. It may well be that you are no longer Jewish. you may marry out. You may marry someone who's non-Jewish. Whether retain your Jewishness is a personal choice in a free and democratic society. Uh,
Right.
where Zionism is really a racial preservation project. It wants to preserve the Jews as some kind of master race, in a sense, forevermore, an artificial construct which we see in Israel today. And of course, the question for the Zionists in Israel is still the same as it was in Germany: who is a Jew? That
Right.
bedeviled the Nazis. They had conferences over it. They couldn't decide the Mischlinge. Were they Jewish? Were they Aryan? Or what were they? The same is
The
true in Israel.
Mischlinger? Sorry, what's that? What term? I didn't.
Mischlinge. It means a Jew who had one or two Jewish grandparents. There was
Right.
actually a first degree Mischlinge who had two Jewish grandparents, and a second degree who had one. If you had three or more, you were Jewish. But if you had one or two, then you were half or a quarter Jew. And that bedeviled them. Were they Jewish or were they non Jewish? So
Right.
just as in South Africa, the question of who was a white was not an easy,
Right.
because race is not a scientific concept,
Right.
it's a social construct. So they had great difficulty matching it up. And in the end, being Jewish was defined in accordance with practicing Judaism going back to 1870. So it rested on what your grandparents adhered to in terms of their religious practice. So it wasn't a race.
This is according to who? Sorry, whose definition was this?
The Nuremberg Law definition,
Okay, got it. Right.
1935.
So if you had one practicing Jewish grandparent, you were Jewish?
No, you weren't. You were quarter Jew. So in practice, you were not
Okay,
Jewish unless you yourself were a practicing Jew.
got it.
Yeah.
So does that mean you wouldn't be sent to a concentration camp?
It wasn't a guarantee, but you were much less likely. The Mischlinge in general survived. In Germany, they did, but in Eastern Europe, they wiped them out anyway. Yeah, although they weren't
Okay.
supposed to. But in Germany, you had a much higher chance of survival if you were a Mischlinge for one Jewish grandparent or two Jewish grandparents. It did mean you'd be drafted into the German army, though. But there was a German general who, Milch, I think his name was, or he was a field marshal who was a Mischlinge, for example. So in general, they survived. It doesn't mean they weren't harassed to some extent, of course. And also, Jews who married non-Jews were called privileged Jews, and therefore they also tended to survive, but they suffered severe harassment. And the non-Jewish spouse was pressurized to divorce them, and so on.
Right. Another person that I've interviewed for this documentary is Marion Ingram, who's from Hamburg, whose father was not Jewish. Her mother was, but actually the mother got a deportation order. And Marion, as a child, apparently walked in to the apartment, and her mom had put her head in the oven
Yeah.
because of the deportation
Mm,
order.
mm.
Before we go on about the history, I do want to ask you about your personal evolution, because you were not raised by anti-Zionists. You were not
Yeah.
raised in an anti-Zionist home. Can you talk about your transformation trajectory?
Yes, I mean, my father was a traveling rabbi, so it, we went to a number of different provincial communities, ending up in Liverpool. Uh, so for the first 11 years of my life, I went to non-Jewish schools, and in Wales, where I went for the final year, it was a heavily Labour socialist miners constituency. So by the age of about 14, 15, I was already a socialist. And my socialism and then Marxism conflicted with Zionism, because for Zionism, what matters most is being Jewish, regardless of class. For socialists, unity of the working class, wherever they're based, is the primary concern. So although Zionism has pretended you can be a socialist Zionist, that pretense has disappeared long ago. I mean, the Labour Zionists are no different from the right wing version. I mean, they were the ones who carried out the Nakba, for instance. So I saw the incompatibility, and I was involved in the fight against apartheid in South Africa. That was my first demonstrations when the rugby tour came to England, the Springboks, in 1970. So I was involved in that, and from that, I began to understand the Palestinian question. And there was a debate at my school. I was in a Jewish school, and it was about Zionism, whether it was right or wrong. And I played devil's advocate because no one else would take the debate. And in the process of researching it, I realized that everything I'd been told had been a fable. I was told, and I'm sure you were told, that
I wasn't raised
you
Zionist, so
weren't. Oh, right. Well, I was. And
I'm a red diaper baby's baby. So
all right. Well, I was told, and it's very, very common, that the reason there was a Palestinian refugee question was the Arabs ran away on the orders of the Arab armies. And we know in 1961, Erskine Children, Rashid Khalidi, investigated this, and they looked at the BBC and the CIA transcripts of the Arab broadcasting stations. And not only were there no orders to leave, but there were orders to stay. Uh, and of course, it fell into place. If you want a Jewish state, how can you possibly have a majority who are not Jewish?
right, of course, right. It's interesting because Gabor Mate was also a Zionist, and he had an aha moment when he was assigned by Zionists to represent the anti-Zionist position as a kind of like intellectual exercise in order to, like know your enemy. And once he investigated that, that's what made him realize that it was one of the few things that made the scales fall from his eyes when it came to Zionism. So were you a true believer before this point, or were you kind of uninvolved?
Uh, I mean, I had volunteered, for instance, to deliver packages for the Jewish National Fund, and I was, like most Jews, exhilarated by the 1967 war, the Six Day War, and so on. So I suppose initially I was a Zionist, and then gradually I came to realize that it wasn't such a good thing. It was a process, as a child, you assimilate the ideas of your parents and those around you, and then you start to develop out on your own. Obviously, that's happening to more and more Jewish kids today as they see the reality of Israel. It's no longer the case that, see, when I was brought up, we were always told we want peace, but the Arabs won't talk to us. But no one can pretend that now. And it's very obvious that Israel is an expansionist apartheid state. You'd have to be blind to not realize that. But in those days, you could be on the left and be a Zionist. But that is not possible now. I mean, they used to hold out the kibbutz as the kind of ideal socialist experiment. I mean, and in the Labour Party, I mean, it was the left who were Zionist, and the pro-Arabs were on the right. Of course, that's no longer the case. The right is uniformly pro-Zionist. It's a badge of identity for them, whereas the left now is primarily anti-Zionist or pro-Palestinian or both.
Right. Not that labor represents the left, right? Because they're as bad as the right.
Well, today, Starmer's Labour, of course, is as bad as you say, as bad as the right. They're carrying out the program of the right.
Right. And did this cause friction with your within your family?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, my first rebellion was not over Zionism; it was over religion. When I told my father at the age of 14 I was an atheist, so that was our first falling out. So the anti-Zionism stemmed from the rejection of the religion. Uh, I guess I was a kind of rationalist, and that's why I became a Marxist because I could see the failings of capitalism. Uh, so anti-Zionism was a progression from that.